மங்கையராய் பிறப்பதற்கே நல்ல மாதவம் செய்திட வேண்டும் அம்மா, said by the great Tamil poet Kavimani Desiya Vinayagam Pillai, which means it is good to be born as a woman with the great blessings of Almighty. Dear students, in the unit of women's movement, we are going to see the first module on women and patriarchy. Before directly going into women's movement, we are in need to understand the basic cause for women's movement and how women were treated in the family and the society in the earlier times. In the patriarchal system, the subordination by the men destroys self-respect, self-esteem and confidence and sets limit on the aspirations of women. Every courageous act that the women perform to assert themselves is condemned as unfeminine. Norms and practices which define them as inferior to men, which impose control through our families, social relations, religion, laws, schools, textbooks, media and workplace. To understand women and patriarchy in detail, in this session we will be looking on women and patriarchy in the Indian context, the concept of patriarchy, origin of patriarchy, impact of patriarchy, control of men in the patriarchal system, evidence of patriarchy in our daily life. Let us see one by one. Women and patriarchy in the Indian context. The women's movement emerged in a new form in the 1960s and 1970s in many parts of the world with the cry of women's liberation and equality for women. In India, the pre-independence women's movement appeared to have retreated after independence. According to one of our foremost feminist scholars, Neera Desai, the reason for the retreat was that the women leaders of that generation believed that the new nation state led by Jawaharlal Nehru would deliver on its promises of equality for women and men, and that the new claims of national development would indeed bring about progress for all. A research was undertaken by a small group of scholars and policy makers on the status of women in India. Its findings were a shock to all, and the data showed that women's status had been declining in the past decades. Neera Desai established the first research center for women's studies in Bombay in 1974. So, in India too, the 1970s saw a new focus on women as subjects of research. The anthropological work has demonstrated the critical roles that women played in the primitive and in the advanced societies. Economists have raised the questions on the non-recognition of women's labor and whether they are paid or unpaid. The twin volumes, Women Writing in India from 600 BC to the present, edited by Susi Tharu and K. Lalita in 1991 and 1993, are the best example in the field of literature which made the worthy attention on women. Why women have been hidden from history, undervalued in their work, treated as secondary to men? Why only exceptional women have been remembered? Why women are considered as marginalized? To understand the above said questions, it became necessary to understand the concept of patriarchy. Let us see the concept of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power, predominant in the roles of political leadership, moral authority, special privilege and control of the poverty. They also hold power in the domain of the family as fatherly figures. Many patriarchal societies are also patrilineal. That means the male lineage inherits the property and title. Here, the female alternative is a matriarchy. Historically, patriarchy has manifested itself in the social, legal, political, economic organization of a range of different cultures. Nowadays, patriarchy is a well-known term. It possesses everyday resonance and used in the casual conversation. It would be interesting for you to know the term patriarchy was by no means invented by feminist scholars. The term comes from 19th century anthropology and literally means the rule of the father. That means from Latin, pater means father and archy means rule. In some other literatures say that patriarchy means that the absolute rule of the father or the eldest male member over his family. The patriarch is typically a societal elder who has legitimate power over others in the social unit. The first person to use the term patriarchy to denote a generalized form of male dominance over women was Friedrich Engels, that is from 1820 to 1895. In a sense, this makes him the first feminist to give a different kind of meaning to the term, that is women's oppression by men. Engels was a close companion of Karl Marx, that is from 1812 to 1883, who wished to complement the materialist account of history as a series of successive class-based societies. In the Marxian scheme of conceptualizing stages in the history, Engels postulated that the earliest societies were classless and relatively egalitarian in structure, with the simple division of labor between men and women and common property relations. This system gave way to distinctions based on property as on controlling women's sexuality and reproduction in the family through relations of servitude. The concept of patriarchy has had mixed fortunes. Other than in Engels' work, the term used by anthropologists to denote patrilineal, that is, the kinship systems where descent and inheritance is through the father. A new generation of feminists and women's studies scholars from the 1970s onwards reinvented this term. They took it out of kinship and anthropology to denote a more general structure of male dominance which enabled men to control the labor and sexuality of women. It explains that women's lack of value and status both historically and socially. Let us see origin of patriarchy. To have clear knowledge and understanding on patriarchy, we should know the origin and the history of patriarchy in detail. One of the most famous attempts on patriarchy was made by the work of Gerda Lerner, an American historian and professor in women's studies. Her major work, The Creation of Patriarchy, was published in 1986. She believed that the history of patriarchal system had emerged thousands of years ago. When people first inhabited the earth, everything that a tribe had was owned in common. All the basic resources like food, water, shelter and animals were equally shared. There were no division of labor and no ruling class, and hence there was no state also. Men hunted large animals while women gathered edible plants and small animals. In the Neolithic hunter-gathering societies, an initial division of labor between women who did the mothering as well as the economic activities combined with childbearing and food gathering, while men were more singularly engaged in big game hunting. With agriculture, production becomes central, so there is a need of more labor. Lerner believes that this led to men wishing to acquire the reproductive potential of women, since children are now the greatest economic assets of the tribe. Children would grow to add strength to the tribe in its battle for survival against nature as well as against other tribes. Her hypothesis is that the entry of agriculture brought the greater inter-tribal warfare, and also with men having more leisure time than women to manage surpluses and enhance their power. Women, in her view, are captured from other tribes while their men are killed, so that such captured women were not only the first slaves but also the first forms of private property. Apart from Lerner's view, in general, during the period of tribe's family, only mothers knew who their children were, since sex was not a one-to-one relationship. The children were traced through their mother's generation line and not their fathers, who they did not know. This was called mother's right, and this setup of society was matrilineal. This form of society still exists in many parts of the world, like tribes of African countries, Khasis and Garo tribes of Meghalaya, Nayars of Kerala, etc. Mother's right made men and women equal. Having developed the ability of planting and breeding of animals, people began to generate surplus, which could be consumed not only by the family but also by others. At the same time, the concept of institution of marriage evolved, which insisted the one-to-one marital relationship that made the men to identify who their children. A whole new setup arose. Production of surplus gave rise to the development of classes, that is, those who got more surplus became masters and slave owners, and those who had none became slaves. Private property evolved. Slaves and tools became the most important possession on those days. Higher order technology was developed in agriculture and animal husbandry. Since men had seized the slaves and produced the tools, they maintained their hold over these assets. Since they already knew their children, the system of handing down their possessions to their offsprings began. They began to hand down their possessions to their male offsprings. As this developed, the right of the father was established. The right of inheritance, right to hand down and receive, and the right to decide within the family. Through this process, our society shifted slowly from being an equitable one where men and women lived life on equal terms to one where men began to command more access, power and say in the decision making process. The women acquired a subordinate position, and gradually through generations of oppression, a woman's status in a society has become unequal. Let us see the impact of patriarchy. In general, patriarchy is a catchword that describes the different ways in which society discriminates against women. In the Anglo-European anthropologists writing in the 19th century, the term patriarchy usually referred to a social system where men were family heads, descent was through the father. Men alone were priests, and all laws and norms were dictated by the male elders in the community. The term patriarchy is often contrasted with the term matriarchy, which referred to a social system where women exercised political authority over men or possessed decisive power and exercised a measure of control over social relationship and everyday life. In the evolution of society, matriarchy was usually considered in the earlier and more primitive stage of society, and patriarchy on later and more advanced stage of society. In contemporary discourses on gender, feminist writers view patriarchy as the subordination of women. The patriarchal system provides self-definitions and norms for women. These social norms restrict the social roles of women as mothers and wives. Both wifehood and motherhood become glorified in the patriarchal system. These roles are granted social sanctions and at the same time are also prized in local folklore, in literature and in religion, so that women actively play their social roles and perpetuate the patriarchal social order. Patriarchy has both productive and punitive aspects. Thus, women who wish to remain single and refuse marriage are treated with disdain by the society. Similarly, women who are not fertile or those who cannot bear children are ridiculed. In India, the position of widow, especially upper caste widows, under the patriarchal system was even pitiable. The upper caste widows were required to shave their heads, wear no ornaments or color garments, as they were viewed with suspicion. Widow remarriage was prohibited. The widow was excluded from social and religious functions of the family, confined to the house and household chores. Those women who did not fall into this pattern of society, their status were ridiculed and criticized for being stubborn and even as unnatural to their basic biology. The nature of patriarchy can differ in different classes even in the same society, from society to society and from time to time. For example, the nature of patriarchy during our grandmother's time was not the same as it is today. It is different for tribal women and for upper caste Hindu women, for women in India and elsewhere. Control of men in the patriarchal system. In a patriarchal system, normally the following areas of the women's life can be said to be under the control of the patriarchal structure. Women's productivity or labor power. Women's productivity both within the household and outside, even when paid, is controlled. At home, women provide all kinds of free service to their children, husbands and other members of the family throughout their lives. Feminist writer Sylvia Walby calls this as the patriarchal mode of production, where women's labor is expropriated by the husbands and others who live there. She calls housewives as the producing class and the husbands are the expropriating class. This back-breaking, endless and repetitive labor is not considered work at all, and housewives become dependent on their husbands. Women's labor outside the home is also controlled in several ways. Women are compelled to work to support the family. Their earnings may be taken away from them. Women are excluded from better paid jobs. They are forced to work at very low wages or work within the home on what is called home-based production. This control over and exploitation of women's labor means that men benefit materially from patriarchy and they derive concrete economic gains from the subordination of women. Women's reproduction. Women's reproductive power is controlled by men in several ways. In many societies, women do not have the freedom to decide how many children they want, when to have them, whether they can use family planning methods or terminate a pregnancy. Apart from individual male control, male-dominated institutions like the church or state also lay down rules regarding women's reproductive capacity. For example, in the Catholic Church, the male religious hierarchy decides whether men and women can use birth control methods. In modern times, the state decides the optimum size of the country's population. Based on that, it actively encourages or discourages women to have children. In India, there has been always a policy to control the population growth rate, while in some other countries like Sweden, where birth rates are very low, incentives are given to women to have children. Women's sexuality. Women are obliged to provide sexual services to their husbands according to their needs and desires. Women's sexuality outside marriage in every society is taboo, while society turns a blind eye to male promiscuity. In some situations, men may force their wives, daughters and other women in their control into prostitution. Rape and threat of rape is another way in which women's sexuality is dominated through an invocation of shame and honor. Overall, women's sexuality is controlled through their dress, behavior and mobility, which are carefully monitored by the family and through social, cultural and religious codes of behavior. Women's mobility. Besides the control of women's sexuality, production and reproduction, her mobility is controlled. Women are subjected to constraints in their mobility in ways that men are not subjected to. Example, using parda limits the interaction between the sexes, restriction on when they can leave home and for what time they should be home, that is before night, etc. Property and other economic resources. Most property and other productive resources are controlled by men and they are passed from one man to another, usually from father to son. Even where women have the legal right to inherit property, a whole range of customs, emotional and social pressures prevent them from acquiring control over them. Evidence of patriarchy in our daily life. The term patriarchy is not only a descriptive term that explains how different societies construct male authority and power, but also become an analytical category. Patriarchy automatically privileges men over women such that women have little or no claims to material, sexual and intellectual resources of the society. That is, in a patriarchal society, women have to struggle to get education, to have property or to make choice on their marriage and other aspects of life. Let us see some illustrations to understand the way in which patriarchy is evident in our daily life. When a man raises his voice in the course of an argument and insists on his point of view without letting women get to utter a single word is considered to be aggressively patriarchal, that is, lack of freedom to express her point of view. When I was born, my family was not quite happy since they wanted a son. This focuses preference for the son for inheritance. My brothers could demand food. They could take the food whatever they wanted. I was told to wait for some time. My mother and sister had to take the food whatever was left over. Discrimination against girls in food distribution. I have to do household work in a routine mainly to support my mother, but my brothers don't do. This shows burden of household work on women and young girls and insisting them to do household work as their female's responsibility. It was a struggle to go to school. My father thought it was not necessary for us girls to study. The other statement, I was given the opportunity to go to college until to get the bridegroom for marriage. This shows lack of educational opportunities for girls. My brothers can come back at any time to my house, but I have to be back before dark. This shows lack of freedom and mobility for girls. My husband used to shout at me and beat me often, that is domestic violence. I was not given the right and the freedom to choose my life partner as my wish, but my brother's desire and decision to choose his wife is welcomed. This shows lack of decision making in choosing the life partner for the girl child. I have to submit my body to my husband whenever he wants it. I have no rights to say to no even though it is my own body. This shows male control over women's bodies and sexuality. I wanted my husband to use family planning methods, but he refused. He also did not give me permission to get myself operated until to give birth for a son instead of a daughter. This shows no control over fertility or reproductive rights. I was thrown out of my job because I was not willing to give into the demands of my employer. Sexual harassment at work. I have no share in my father's property. My husband's property is also not mine. This shows lack of inheritance of property rights for women. Thus, these are illustrations show the discrimination and impose of patriarchy among the women by men. Yet in the present society, most of the above statements are true. It may differ based on the level of acceptance for the change of patriarchy. Patriarchy is bound in its nature and very strongly agreed and welcomed by the women themselves, since without knowing the difference between whether they are taken care of, that is protection, or dominated by the men. The patriarchal system starts from the family itself. In a family, the man is considered as the head of the family. This is where a child learns the first lesson in hierarchy, subordination, control and discrimination. Boys learn to assert and dominate, girls to submit and to accept unequal treatment. A minority of women have learned to assert themselves in a patriarchal system, assume new roles, cross the boundaries set for them by society and achieve positions by power. But the majority of women learn to abide by the system and accept it without question. Often, those who accept the system also perpetuate the patriarchal system. Yet in many families, we come across incidents of a mother discriminating between her son and daughter, or in cases of female infanticide, it is mostly a female member of the family who probably undertakes this act of sacrificing the girl child. In several instances, it is the mother-in-law who is engaged in harassing the daughter-in-law under the cover of patriarchy, probably to gain a better position in the family. To conclude this topic, these discussions clearly brings out the way in which patriarchy differentiates men and women, and through such differential treatment, women are denied to access the resources of the society and to positions of power and authority both in the family and in the community. Finally, a motivational note for the women. Don't wait for the opportunity. Create your own opportunity to lead women's life in a great success. Thank you.